While browsing through YouTube like I usually do, watching videos as the algorithm commands, I came into a loop of lo-fi, ambient and relaxing playlists. Nothing unusual there, till I found this. I don't know what it was, but the thumbnail immediately captured my attention. I never heard of Sovietwave before, but soon after I clicked on it, I think I knew what it was all about. It just felt right. After the first video, many more followed suit, all unique but also somehow similar. It didn't matter if it was a broken down building or a poster promising our interstellar future. They all had something in common. There was something hidden behind the crackling of old radio speakers and the soft overtones of sine waves. I immediately get a sense of nostalgia from the combination of listening and watching what was being presented to me. And apparently I was not the only one. In the comments, everyone shared their experience of being overcome with a similar emotion. Not only Russians too, but people from all over the world. I asked myself, why does it work? How does Sovietwave achieve this universal feeling of nostalgia and camaraderie? Is it connected to history, and how does it fit in with the eerie post-Soviet aesthetic becoming ever more prominent in our generation? To try to answer all that, we have to start somewhere. And what better way to do that than to start at the beginning, the origin of Sovietwave. Vaporwave as a music genre came to be in the early 2010s. Influenced from the 80s and 90s, oftentimes it served as an homage to old imagery and pop culture like film soundtracks, which was often synthwave. The audio samples from old advertisements or announcements were getting chopped and screwed, pitched and slowed down. In a way, it was a satire take on the commercialized aspects of life in the 80s. Since Vaporwave largely takes place on the internet, being produced, distributed and listened to online, in real life, events were rare. In this sense, Vaporwave is a spatially decentralized music genre, meaning it has no clear country of origin, no main source or market in any one country or region. This makes it a kind of universal music, springing from a collective mentality and pure creative expression rather than profit-driven production studios. It's fitting to convey sentiments and fitting to make others relate to the same things or feel nostalgia, even if they didn't experience it. By the way, there's even a special term for that, it's anemoia. And this relating and understanding is exactly what's happening with Sovietwave. The music is used as a common ground for younger generations to feel a connection to a past they never directly experienced, but grew up with, for example with old cartoons and so on. It uses samples from old commercials, politician speeches and radio announcements. Listening to it, you can't help but notice the theme about dreams for space and progress, which have disappeared with the collapse of the Soviet Union, together with positive childhood reminiscence and other utopic hopes held by so many of the older generations. Back to Vaporwave, you will recognize the overall aesthetic of ethereal imagery, pastel color schemes and technology. Maybe it's a way of saying, hey, remember, because the technology shift could make our own times retro and obsolete by tomorrow. We live in times of rapid changes, which will become important later on. Also, in the context of Soviet history, it serves as a portrayal of a past with an innocence and lightheartedness which, in this way, never existed in real life. A comment below the first video sums it up pretty fittingly. Vaporwave, music about a future we think we could have. Retrowave, music about a future we thought we were going towards. Sovietwave, music about a future we tried to build. So, is it just about reminiscing in memories of a once glorious past, which we can all relate to, or, more specific to its origin, coping with a failure as a nation to fulfill a generation's dream and hopes about the future? But before we'll get to the conclusion of this, we have a lot more ground to cover. After all, the music itself is not the only thing significant here. Like I mentioned, I came across it because of the vivid image of iconic architecture depicted in one of them. Also the theme of space, but we'll get to that later. And it is not the only one. In every second video of Sovietwave you can see this trend continued, so how did architecture play a role in shaping this post-Soviet aesthetic? I don't think it's an exaggeration to point out how special these pictures are given their context in which they are presented. They don't show the usual quote-unquote aesthetic imagery of Greek busts, Macintoshes or stylized sunsets. In short, they break with the usual formula of vapor and retrowave. They indicate something new. Looking at the first building gave me the impression of loneliness and desolation, but also that of great former power, enforced by the sheer massiveness and broad, sweeping concrete face spanning the building. The Vaporwave typical color palette was still clearly visible in the detached-looking pink and blue hues that seemed to veil the image, alluring the viewer, creating this trademark retro, nostalgic look. And after a bit of modern magic involving reverse image search, it clicked. The feeling it gave me totally made sense, because this picture doesn't only show one of many brutalist Soviet buildings all over the place back then, it shows the Russian White House. But it has meaning beyond being a place and or display of Soviet power. A bit of digging brought up another fact. It was also the stage for the October coup of 1993. Quick summary for all of you not so in touch with Soviet history. The October coup in 1993 was a standoff between the Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, you know, this guy here, and the parliament. Yeltsin intended to dissolve the Congress of People's Deputies and the parliament called Supreme Soviet, although the constitution didn't give him the right to do so, obviously. He claimed that by dissolving the Russian parliament in September 1993, he was clearing the tracks for a rapid transition to a functioning market economy. The parliament declared the president's decision unlawful, impeached him, and proclaimed Vice President Rutskoy to be president. On the 3rd of October, demonstrators took over the mayor's office and tried to storm the Ostankino television center. The army stormed the building on October 4th by Yeltsin's order and arrested the leader of the resistance. Basically, this event brought Russia on the brink of a civil war. 147 people were killed and over 400 wounded. It was declared the deadliest single event of street fighting in Moscow's history since the Russian Revolution, and it left a scar in people's perception of a righteous government. With this knowledge, I looked at the picture again, and at last I realized you can still see the burnt down facade of the building in the picture. Something I hadn't even realized till then, but now it was clear as day, clear to see for anyone who was looking. The creator consciously chose to use a photograph of the aftermath rather than the monument in its full glory. It only reassured me that I was on the right track with my hypothesis, having the building follow suit so many others, decaying and standing vacant as a memorial to once glorious past. But though impressive for sure, the White House isn't the only building of its kind. Starting from the mid-20th century, iconic brutalist structures started to appear all over the Soviet Union. Often criticized as soulless or hostile, many of our generation seem to find a liking in their old design. Brutalist buildings are hard to define yet relatively easy to recognize. Some would call these concrete structures soulless or bizarre, which, looking at some of their forms, is probably fair. It seems they don't really add anything to the modern city's landscape nor take anything away. They're just there, they levitate in a kind of time vacuum stuck between epochs, like silent reminders of long-gone times. The influence of brutalism reached Soviet architecture roughly in the 1960s and 70s after de-Stalinization reforms, when low-cost and function-oriented architecture became relevant once again. Soviet post-Stalinist architecture embedded the most prominent features of the brutalist movement. Massive, block-like shapes, simple textures and homogeneous color, and sometimes adding elements that reflected Soviet achievements in technology and science. Some of the most remarkable examples of Soviet brutalist architecture can be found in Kiev. The National Museum of the History of Ukraine in the Second World War, the House of Furniture, Hotel Salute, the Verdansky National Library of Ukraine, and many more. Today, most East European republics have gone over to tear down the old Soviet symbols, trying to cut ties with their past and coming to terms with their Soviet heritage, or should I say legacy. Besides, concrete facades are blackening over time, becoming streaked with water or rust stains, and they require regular maintenance for which, let's be honest, nobody wants to take responsibility for. Some argue that an unchanged landscape is a powerful reminder of our past. It tells us about what happened then and what is still happening to us today. Among them are Alex Bykov and Yevgenia Gubkina, the authors of a book called Soviet Modernism, Brutalism, Post-modernism, Buildings and Structures in Ukraine from 1956 to 1991. What a title. Honestly, I can't recommend it enough for anyone interested in this topic beyond just a video on YouTube. The authors believe that all architectural styles are a part of global history, and so they possess a cultural value that should be appreciated. Sergei Filipenko, general manager of the Kowalska Industrial Construction Group, who supported the book publishing, comments, modernism and brutalism carried a very strong ideological component, but now we see a lot of commercial projects with no message to society at all. The book also presents a deeper approach to the problem of destroying historical buildings and reveals the real motives behind demolition initiatives in post-Soviet countries. Another aspect of Soviet architecture, one that came after the imposing structures of early Soviet brutalism, are the iconic panelka housings, or panel buildings, for thousands of people, which are still standing today. These buildings have their basis in a housing crisis the Soviets were facing back then. More and more people moved into cities, the cities grew more and more densely populated, space became scarce. Khrushchevkas appeared, communal housings, type of low-cost concrete panel buildings, never higher than 5 or 6 floors, you've seen them. With this new technique, whole cities appeared from the ground in just a few months. Most recognizable by their lack of detail and their always same appearance, notorious for their lack of space and privacy. Also, there was no elevator, just a little bonus. The block-like design was later being picked up and replicated by Brezhnev, just to a much larger scale, creating the defining look found not only in almost every major Russian city today, but also in all of these Russian Duma playlists, something I won't touch on here even though they contribute to the modern post-Soviet aesthetic. The K7 design from the early 60s can still be found all over the former Soviet Union, even though most of the buildings, since not being camped to, are falling into a state of urban decay and desolation. But that has only given them a strange new charm, which nostalgia-driven explorers and people yearning for the past are so eager to get. Great, architecture done, let's go over to space. Beginning in the late 1950s, with the ever-growing tensions of the Cold War, space would become another battleground for the US and the Soviets, as both wanted to prove the superiority of their technology, military firepower, and, by extensions, their political and economic system. Basically, it once again represented the fight of communism against capitalist ideals, and that way the space race began. The Soviet Union not only launched the first artificial satellite, but also officially inaugurated the space race with the US. Sputnik 1 went into space on October 4, 1957. They also sent the first human to space, Yuri Gagarin, who reached orbit on April 12, 4 years later. However, ambition and human endeavor didn't end there, and the people shifted their gazes to what would become the next big achievement in spaceflight, the Moon. Soviet space programs, for a long time a closely guarded secret, became a powerful propaganda tool, sparking a new wave of Soviet art. Nonetheless, it also had popular support from the artists themselves. In the 1960s, suddenly everyone is very enthusiastic about the idea of being in space, says Alexandra Sankova, artist and director of the Moscow Design Museum. Designers were making images inspired by these space achievements, not because it was a mass thing to do, but because they were hugely proud and inspired. This mentality is one resonating strongly in the artworks of their time, but also the works of today, the ones I stumble across. The cosmic icons could be found everywhere, says Sankova. Textile designers were very happy to use it, and also industrial designers and the makers of monumental art, sculptures, mosaics and architecture, but also everyday objects. People should be surrounded by their new vision of a better future. As Sankova writes in the introduction to the book Soviet Space Graphics, which collects some of the art and designs held at the museum, throughout the entire period, Soviet citizens lived vicariously through the images they consumed. For the majority, it was the only way to experience the thrill of boundless discovery and to embrace the potential of science to lift a nation beyond so many years of struggle. Like nothing else, the iconography of space exploration inspired and united the people behind the promise of progress and prosperity, of pushing the boundaries of human capabilities. By landing on the Moon in 1969, the United States effectively won the space race that had begun with Sputnik's launch in 1957. The Soviets failed to repeat this achievement, and in the time span of the early 80s till 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, making further competitive research unfeasible for both parties. On the one side, relations between the US and the New East became more peaceful after the end of the space race and the Cold War, but the loss of the Soviets suffered still echoed through the public mindset. Not only did the Soviet Union dissolve, but the lost space race stood as a symbol of the lost opportunity for progress and the failure of achieving the Soviets' goals of a brighter, bigger, better future. Not only seen in their attempted conquest of space, but all parts of life, like massive imposing architecture, from that point on abandoned and left to decay. It resonated through society, sparking artistic expression as a kind of venting mechanism, one of which was music. Enhanced by the distance in time and the added nostalgia, this effect still holds up today, as everyone can experience if they decide to listen to Sovietwave. And with the fall of the Soviet Union, all parts of the Soviet legacy were beginning to be looked at critically. Further space exploration was halted, and the towering and imposing structures of brutalist architecture were left abandoned, as if to forget the past or, in some cases, to erase it completely. The post-Soviet condition seen now is the result of all the things mentioned, and more. With the collapse of the Soviet Union came a set of new rules and power structures regarding the political state, international relations, trade, art, fashion, culture, TV commercials, and all kinds of Western influences. Some 30 years later, the term post-Soviet now starts to pop up again in the form of an aesthetic movement created by a new generation. In 1980, Paul Virillo first introduced the concept of the aesthetic of disappearance in his eponymous work. But it cannot only be related to the post-Soviet mindset, it's honestly all over the place. However, the aesthetic of disappearance is a phenomenon picked up by our generation and augmented hundredfold by social media. We could ask, in other words, why is it that our Instagram feeds and YouTube recommendations are suddenly flooded with Cyrillic quotes, repurposed Cold War buildings, lavish underground stations, chaotic midday raves, and retro-futurist video clips? Maybe it's a response to the state of our modern reality, a kind of attempt to return to simpler days, a notion which I'm sure everyone can sympathize with quite well, regardless of their age. Haris Yanuras, writer, researcher, and curator based in Cologne, Germany, puts this a bit more eloquently. The state of the information society favors an intelligent, rapid exchange mechanism, which floods our everyday lives with an absurd amount of data that flow through our Facebook feed, Insta stories, newspapers, hopes, and dreams. Perhaps even more than ever, the human mind lies bare in front of the most wonderful chaos of information to such a degree that it becomes an unbearable burden. Worth mentioning here is also the subculture of Gopniks, young people born and raised poor in those Khrushchevkas popular in the crisis years of the 1960s. Putin's Russia, both economically and socially overwhelmed by political scandals, the pandemic, and the oil crisis, now seems to be at a similar kind of breaking point. And what was an offensive stereotype has become a pop aesthetic. A touch of irresistible rough coolness, a dash of craziness, and a shot of nihilism. And vodka. Lots of vodka. This kind of national stereotype does not immediately fall into the category of offensive cliches, but it's part of a wider movement of cultural consciousness. There stays a fundamental ambiguity of Russia in its cultural expression. To quote Winston Churchill here, Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Anastasia Fedorova describes growing up as part of one of the first post-Soviet generations as facing the deeper struggles of understanding who we are. She criticizes the way many think of living in a post-Soviet world as over-romanticizing as she puts it, it involves more than a background of tower blocks. One should not disregard the internal cultural clash of Soviet past and modernity as a pure aesthetic, which is what I'm doing right now, so sorry, I guess? Russian photographer Igor Rogalev tries to document this process of inner struggle and quest for belonging in his project Synchronicity, mostly taking place in Kiev. I took photographs that were made in other parts of the Soviet area like Minsk and Moscow as well, because I felt that they do relate to the same issues and have the strong sensation of the invisible catastrophes in them. The process of decommunization, dismantling the legacies and erasing the symbols of the communist state which started in Ukraine after the revolution, that has quickly become one of the central ideas of his project. I am focusing on the experience of adolescence in the time of decommunization, Rogalev states. This policy is broadly discussed in Ukraine now and is strongly doubted and opposed by the Ukrainian art community. On the other hand, decommunization is accompanied by the formal and populist use of the Soviet aesthetic in Russia and Belarus. I think that both types of handling the past are actually the different variations of the same process. Artificial creation of the national identities based on the historical revisionism. He continues with saying how he wanted to avoid exoticizing post-Soviet life in a Western way. I try to examine post-socialist Eastern Europe as not some picturesque exotic area, but as a quintessential fragment of the larger pattern. the modernity that is marked by a sensation of the invisible catastrophe. Rogalev captures the grandeur of these monumental structures built for utopian ideals, dreamy landscapes, overall just random moments which evoke and trigger memories, the same way Sovietwave does with its use of similar imagery of the, as Rogalev puts it, invisible catastrophe. This invisible catastrophe Rogalev describes is clearly audible in the tracks now flooding our YouTube feeds. The music and images aren't peaceful, not in that literal sense. In a way, one feels an uncanny mix of emotions, almost inflicting the same emotional ambiguity of post-Soviet generations on oneself. It oozes nostalgia and a kind of desperation and loss incomparable with anything else in the same cultural ballpark. The cultural heritage of the Soviet Union is complicated, but the post-Soviet generations have found their own way to deal with their legacy. Sovietwave is used as a kind of rebranding, using old things to evoke new emotions, conjure up connections, just trying to make sense of a world drifting off to the absurd, getting faster and faster while we seem to stay still, drifting apart ever so slightly. New generations begin to discover parts of their heritage and use it to try to understand and build their own identity in a world where we all struggle with an ambiguity of belonging. They use music, and a universal genre at that, to create a common ground of which to converse, understand, empathize, and generally just exist together for a short time, transient in this ever-shifting reality. It works because the feeling of awe and discovery, the longing for progress and a better future can be shared by all people, detached from the former political, ethical, or national context. It is universal. In a way, it doesn't matter where or which generation you were born into, because in a certain sense, we all stay dreamers.